Kenda, in our consultation today, we really enjoyed working through your paper together, and I know one of the opening themes was you wanted to get at the question of how joy had this awakening capacity, this arousing capacity. Help us understand what you mean by joy as arousal, as awakening.
I started thinking about joy during the way teenagers are experiencing it, and it seemed like there was a parallel track to what's going on in their bodies sexually and what's going on in their openness to experience that they experience as joy. I think they probably confuse the two sometimes. What's sexual and what's a spiritual experience of joy? Anybody who's been in a church camp knows that the spiritual high and the high I get from falling in love with you while I'm at church camp are pretty closely tied. I did have a couple once say that they tell me that they were holding hands a lot because they were praying together. And I was like, yeah, I'll bet you are. And anyway, so arousal is as joy is a way I think it actually gets filtered through the adolescent experience, or joy as arousal is probably a better way to say it, partly because those sexual overtones are very closely aligned. What's behind all of that, I think, I use the story of Eutychus being in the back of the room when Paul was having his all-night preach-a-thon. And I'd like to think that if that had been an experience of joy, Eutychus would not have been at the edge of the church at all. He wouldn't have been falling asleep in the window. He wouldn't have fallen out of the window and fallen out onto the pavement dead. He would not have been a youth who started out in the church and then wound up outside of the church, which is a very familiar story. But he would have been in the middle of the community, experiencing the joy of living into the person that God had created him to be. And our communities of faith help us do that. So if our communities of faith are helping adolescents do that, then it seems to me that they're going to have to come to terms with some of the ways that teenagers experience joy. So here's the way I carved it up. One is they experience joy as kind of this generative exuberance, and the generativity of joy has some sexual overtones, but Paul talks about joy as a fruit of the Spirit. So it seeds life, literally, and it's also something that is the result of life. So there's this generative nature of joy that is part of the adolescent experience. And what we know in terms of cognitive neurology is that seems to be true for joy is associated with generative states. So creative states, flow states, are experiences very joyous kinds of things. Empathy, the experience of being deeply understood by somebody else, is something that we experience as joy, and our brains reflect that, actually. So anyway, that's the generative part of it. The second part of joy as arousal, I talk about in terms of ecstasy. And you and I have talked about this, but the joy as ecstasy is based on the Greek word ekstasis, which means to stand beside. So we are literally beside ourselves. We can't be contained when we are in an ecstatic situation, which is very much part of adolescence. The experience of self as not being something you can contain all the time is a huge part of the adolescent experience. And again, we sometimes associate that with the spiritual high that teenagers get at a concert or something, but I think it doesn't have to always be explosive or eruptive. I think it can also be, particularly as we mature, to be kind of a slowly emanating kind of outward movement from ourselves. So it's really tied to moving beyond ourselves, which moves us towards others, moving beyond ourselves, which moves us towards God. And what's interesting about that is, of course, this is exactly what God did with us. God in the Trinity moved towards us beyond God's own self. And so, in some ways, our ecstatic response in joy is a response to God's ecstatic coming to us. The third way I talk about it is in terms of locomotion. Joy moves us. And by locomotion, that's an Ericksonian term, but I'm talking about the experience of being moved, which is so important during adolescence. I think every teenager would say, if it moves me, it's good, you know. And that gets confused into, if it moves me, it must be God, which may or may not be the truth. But joy certainly moves us, right? So sometimes that's physical. Teenagers experience joy as active, and something that's, we understand joy as a practice in the church. Sometimes it's experiential or existential, where we are moved by encountering another's need, for example, that moves us. And I love the business when Jesus is talking with his disciples, you know, and he's got the guy with the withered hand comes up to him, and the Greek says that Jesus was moved, and so he heals him. But what the Greek really says is Jesus' guts turned over inside of him. Jesus was moved, but boy, in a really big way. And we forget the messiness that goes with that. And so all of those things are much closer to what teenagers are experiencing in terms of sexual maturation, and not so much close to singing, I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart. So we probably should mess it up a little if it's going to be authentic.